In July of 1973, deep in the northern Pennsylvania timberland, 7 children were discovered standing in a perfect circle around a dead oak tree. Their clothes were nearly dissolved by weather, their hair tangled with soil and pine needles, and carved across their skin were raised white scars forming symbols no one in the state had ever documented. When the trooper who found them asked for their names, the children answered together in a calm, unified voice, "We're Haverly." And then they fell silent. Doctors, investigators, linguists, none of them could explain who these children were, why they appeared without warning, or how they had survived for years unseen. What they didn't know was that the scars weren't just wounds. They were information, a record, a system of knowledge buried long before the United States existed. These markings held a story powerful enough that, within weeks, officials sealed every report, confiscated every photograph, and moved the children to undisclosed locations. The public was told nothing. The case was quietly erased. But the truth didn't disappear. It was hidden, intentionally, because what those children carried on their skin threatened to expose a history America was never meant to see. Today we're going to uncover that history, the lost lineage, the forbidden markings, and the reason the Haverly clan was protected for centuries by people who understood exactly what those children represented. Before we go further, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what state are you watching from? The forests of northern Pennsylvania do not give up their secrets easily. Even in the 1970s, when highways carved through the hills and mining towns dotted the valleys, there were places where the land seemed older than the maps drawn over it. Locals called these stretches the Forgotten Timber, a region where radio signals died, compass needles drifted, and the silence settled thick enough to muffle your own footsteps. This was the landscape that shaped the first chapter of the Haverly mystery. Long before the children appeared, the area had its own quiet warnings. Hunters reported hearing voices in places where no one lived. Survey teams found property lines that contradicted official records, as if the land itself had been claimed and reclaimed for generations without ever being written down. Rangers spoke of abandoned homesteads with symbols carved into doorframes, circles, intersecting lines and marks that looked almost mathematical. Most people ignored these stories. Rural Pennsylvania was full of folklore, but those old rumors gained terrifying clarity the day the 7 children were found. To understand why their discovery rattled the county, you have to know what the region looked like. In the early 1970s, the logging industry was collapsing, leaving behind empty mills and towns losing population by the month. Farms were abandoned, roads fell into disrepair, and entire ridges went unpatrolled for years at a time. There were families living off-grid, some by choice, some by poverty, and a few by tradition. Most officers in the area had learned not to ask too many questions. When a cabin showed signs of life but no registered name, that summer had been unusually foggy, days where the sky refused to brighten, and the forest held a damp chill long after sunrise. The state police station in Bradford County was operating on a skeleton crew, handling little more than minor disputes, poaching complaints, and trespassing calls from landowners worried about drifters. The call that came in on July 16, 1973, sounded like one of those routine cases. A caretaker at an old sawmill reported movement near a restricted section of forest. He assumed it was teenagers or maybe someone looking for scrap metal. The dispatcher logged it without urgency. Trooper Mark Ellery, a 32-year-old officer with 7 years on the job, volunteered to check it out. Ellery knew the forest well. He'd grown up only a few towns over and spent most of his childhood hunting, fishing, and exploring trails that didn't appear on official maps. But that morning felt different. He later wrote that the fog moved in waves, like something breathing, and that the birdsong he expected at dawn was strangely absent. He parked his patrol car near an overgrown logging road and walked in alone, boots sinking slightly into the damp moss. What he didn't know was that only a few hundred yards ahead, 7 children stood silently around a dead oak tree waiting. Their presence in those woods wasn't accidental. It wasn't random. And within minutes, Ellery's discovery would trigger a chain of events that authorities would spend decades trying to bury. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, have you ever visited a place that felt older than the history written about it? The story of the Haverly clan cannot be understood without stepping into the lives of the people who lived behind those rotting wooden walls, miles from any witness, miles from any help. Each person carried secrets long before the investigation, peeled back their skin, literally and metaphorically. Nathaniel Haverly, born in 1932 near Pine Hollow, Pennsylvania, grew up with a father who believed isolation was the only path to purity. Nathaniel learned discipline through silence, obedience through deprivation, and faith through fear. By the time he turned 20, he had already developed the worldview that outsiders were a contagion. When he inherited the family's remote 14-acre farmland in 1954, he saw it not as property but as a sanctuary from a world he believed was corrupted. Nathaniel rarely spoke in town, but on the few occasions he did, he recorded strange rants about keeping corruption out of the blood. Shopkeeper recalled him mumbling, "If they stay untouched, they stay whole." His handwriting, found years later in a torn ledger, repeated a single line on multiple pages. Only the untainted survive. Martha Caldwell Haverly, Nathaniel's wife, was a different story entirely. Born in 1938 in Butler County, she spent her early life in and out of state care. Reports from the Pennsylvania Youth Bureau described her as quiet, withdrawn, eager to please. In 1957, she met Nathaniel through a church outreach program. He was 25, she was 19. Their relationship moved quickly, too quickly for the few people who knew her. A friend from the program later stated in a 1976 interview, she looked relieved when she married him, like she thought she had finally found someone who'd make decisions for her. Martha rarely left the property after 1961. Her world shrank to the farmhouse, the fields, and the children she bore into it. The children formed the core of the strange enclosed universe. Elias Haverly, born in 1958, was remembered by the town's old-school registrar as a quiet boy who suddenly vanished after only 2 weeks of classes. His records were mysteriously withdrawn, and no explanation was provided. He was 8 years old the last time anyone outside the family saw him alive. Next came Ruth Ann, born in 1961. No pictures exist of her apart from the ones investigators reconstructed from dental sketches. Her early years were spent entirely at home, under rules her father enforced with unshakable rigidity. A neighbor remembered seeing her only once, standing at the edge of the Haverly property, barefoot in winter, staring without blinking. Then there were the twins, Jonas and Miriam, born in 1965. According to a nurse who worked at Pine Hollow Medical Center at the time, the birth was rushed, frantic and unsettling. She later told reporters, "He didn't want the babies touched, not even to clean them." The twins never appeared in public records again, not in school rolls, medical logs, or county forms. And finally, the youngest, Samuel, born in 1969. His existence was discovered only after investigators found a small, hand-carved wooden toy with his initials. Samuel's life, like his siblings, was shaped by strict routines, controlled interactions, and a father who enforced silence as survival. Each member of the Haverly family lived inside a controlled world, one built on fear, ritual, and secrecy. But what none of them understood was that Nathaniel's obsession was quietly transforming their bodies. And when the truth was finally uncovered in 1973, investigators realized the family wasn't just isolated, they were changing. By the late 1960s, the Haverly farmhouse had entered a state the county later described as deliberate decay. Windows were boarded, even when unbroken. Doors were locked from the outside as often as from within. No one could track when the family last purchased supplies. What the community didn't realize was that Nathaniel had begun enforcing what he called the purity regimen, a strict set of rules that would determine every waking moment of the children's lives. The children grew thinner over the years, paler. Their mother, Martha, tried to intervene quietly, slipping them extra food or whispering hopeful words late at night. But Nathaniel noticed everything. In 1967, he locked her bedroom from the outside for 3 days. When she emerged, she stopped resisting him altogether. The year 1970 brought the first major crack in the walls of secrecy. A traveling census worker, James Wallace, arrived at the property after multiple unanswered notices. He later recounted the encounter in a sworn statement. "I saw shapes at the windows, small ones, but every time I looked up, the faces would disappear. Nathaniel blocked the doorway, claimed he lived alone and refused entry. Wallace noted the foul smell coming from inside. Something metallic, something spoiled. He filed a report with his supervisor, but no follow-up was made. Inside conditions worsened. Winter storms destroyed part of the roof, leaving the children to sleep in makeshift beds pulled close together for warmth. Martha tried to comfort them with stories, but even her voice sounded fragile. Elias took on the role of protector, sheltering his siblings from their father's temper and the increasingly unpredictable rules. The children whispered to each other that their skin felt different. It dried too quickly. It cracked even when warm. Jonas claimed his fingernails always looked dark, as if stained with soil that never washed away. One night in 1972, Ruth Ann attempted to run. She made it as far as the fence line before Nathaniel caught her. Her screams carried through the pines, heard faintly by a neighbor more than a mile away. That neighbor, Harold Briggs, reported hearing an animal in distress. He didn't know it was a child until much later. After that night, Nathaniel intensified his isolation tactics. He removed the family's remaining mirrors. He boarded the attic and the cellar. He restricted the children's access to sunlight. Elias wrote, "He says light changes us. He says darkness keeps us whole." But something else had begun happening, something Nathaniel hadn't planned for. The children's bodies reacted strangely to the extreme confinement. The malnutrition, the contaminated well water. Their skin took on a translucent quality under candlelight. Their veins appeared darker than normal. Their eyes adjusted unnaturally well to the dark. Even Martha noticed, whispering to Elias one night, "This isn't natural. None of this is natural." The breaking point came in January 1973, when a fierce storm knocked out the region's power. Pine Hollow's Sheriff's Department attempted a welfare sweep of remote homes. Deputy Linda Brooks was assigned to the Haverly property. She knocked repeatedly with no answer. But through a crack in one of the boarded windows, she saw something. 5 small figures huddled together in the dark, motionless, their skin reflecting light in a way she had never seen before. She radioed in, "There are children inside. They don't look right." What she didn't know was that she had just triggered the investigation that would reveal the Haverly family's final secret, and once the door was forced open, the truth waiting inside would haunt Pennsylvania for decades. When the officers finally breached the Haverly farmhouse on July 16, 1973, they expected to find neglected children, maybe an abused family, nothing more. Instead, they stepped into a silence so dense it felt like a physical barrier. The air held the smell of wet wood, iron, and something unfamiliar, something almost chemical. Dust hung suspended in the beams of their flashlights, drifting like ash. The children did not react at first. They stood in a tight group near the center of the room, eyes wide, pupils dilated far beyond normal. Their skin, that was the first thing every officer noticed. It wasn't pale in a sickly way, it was pale in a way that suggested an entirely different environment, one without sunlight, warmth, or natural aging. Their veins appeared almost patterned, dark lines branching under the surface like roots beneath snow. Deputy Brooks approached slowly. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're here to help." Elias raised his chin but did not move. His voice trembled. "We can't leave."
He said the air outside breaks us.
Before the officers could respond, a sound drifted from the basement, slow, steady, rhythmic. A scraping, a dragging, something alive down there. They followed it, descending a narrow staircase that groaned with every step. The basement was colder than it should have been for midsummer. In the far corner stood a row of glass jars filled with murky water. Inside each one floated something pale, fingertips, strips of skin, samples, labels dated years apart. Brooks lifted one jar closer to the beam of her light. The date read August 12, 1966, the label beneath it, Stage 2. A notebook lay open on a work table, its pages filled with cramped handwriting, Nathaniel's. It wasn't religious rambling. It wasn't madness. It was method. Notes detailing environmental controls, exposure durations, hydration cycles, experiments, testing the limits of his own children, testing how their bodies changed when deprived of heat, sunlight, nutrients, and normal human contact. Skin resilience increased by 18% after 7 months of restriction. Night vision improved noticeably. Pupils respond differently to low-light environments. Surface blood supply reduces under controlled stress. Martha interferes. The final pages were the most disturbing. They will endure what the world cannot. Human bodies were not made for the coming cycles. Ours must be, officers realized then. Nathaniel wasn't trying to hurt his children. He thought he was transforming them, preparing them for some imagined future. But his methods, starvation, sensory deprivation, chemical exposure, were destroying them. When the officers returned upstairs, the children had moved. They stood near the front door now, huddled but determined. Elias spoke again. He said the world changes skin. He said ours must not break. Brooks knelt. He was wrong. None of this should have happened to you. Ruth Ann, barely 9, whispered, "Are we normal?" No one answered. The revelation spread quickly. Medical teams confirmed abnormalities, reduced sensitivity to heat, unusually slow healing, unnaturally sharp night vision. But none of it was supernatural. It was the result of years of extreme, deliberate conditioning. The truth was darker than any folklore. Nathaniel hadn't been preserving his children. He had been remaking them, and the marks on their skin were not signs of a curse. They were evidence of a father who believed survival required sacrifice beyond human limits. The discovery of the Haverly children set off a chain reaction that the authorities were completely unprepared to handle. Within 24 hours, the farmhouse was sealed off, the property surrounded by police tape, and state investigators flooded into the quiet outskirts of Pine Hollow. Reporters arrived next, turning the once ignored hillside into a headline machine. But no matter how many officials spoke in front of microphones, none of them could answer the single question everyone whispered. How could this happen for a decade without anyone noticing? The children were transferred to Mercy Hill Medical Center under strict supervision. Doctors expected signs of emotional shock, fear, and malnutrition. What they did not expect were physiological changes that defied standard explanations. Routine exams revealed that the children's bodies reacted differently to stimulus: skin that blistered more slowly under heat tests, pupils that remained wide even under bright lamps, and reflex responses more consistent with people raised in near-permanent darkness. Medical reports were cautious. Journalists were not. Within days, newspapers published phrases like sunless children, the light-starved, family, and the children who grew in the dark. The Haverly siblings became symbols misunderstood, sensationalized, and dissected by a public eager for answers no one had. Meanwhile, the investigation into Nathaniel Haverly's motives intensified. Officers combed through every notebook, every jar, every sample in the basement, trying to construct a timeline. Prosecutors prepared over a dozen charges, including aggravated child abuse, involuntary confinement, and experimental harm. But one question complicated everything. Where was Nathaniel now? The night the children were rescued, Nathaniel had vanished. His truck remained in the shed. His tools were still on the table, but the man himself had slipped into the fog-choked forest, leaving no footprints on the wet moss. Search teams spent weeks combing the woods, finding only burned scraps of paper and a half-collapsed campsite. Locals whispered he had gone deeper into the timber, perhaps to continue his work alone. Others said he had drowned in one of the old quarry pits. Officially, he was declared missing. Unofficially, the county lived in fear he might return. For the children, the consequences were more complicated. They were placed temporarily in foster care, but every home struggled with the same issues: extreme sensitivity to noise, difficulty adjusting to daylight, and a constant, unshakable fear of open spaces. Social workers noted that Elias often slept sitting upright, as if listening for danger. Ruth Ann refused to enter rooms without checking the corners first. Jonas experienced panic attacks whenever a door closed behind him. Therapists agreed on one thing: the children weren't just traumatized. They had been conditioned. Their father had reshaped their understanding of the world until confinement felt like safety and sunlight felt like threat. The town of Pine Hollow faced consequences too. People questioned their own silence. How many warnings had they ignored? How many sounds in the night had they dismissed? And how many families lived in similar isolation, hidden by distance, poverty, or fear? Schools added welfare checks. Churches organized outreach programs. The sheriff's department rewrote its policy for rural oversight. But the damage had already been done. The Haverly case became a permanent stain on county history, a reminder of how easily suffering can exist right beside ordinary life unseen. What haunted officials most wasn't what they found in the basement. It was the realization that the children's transformation wasn't an accident. It was the intended outcome. In the years that followed, the Haverly case settled into a strange space between documented history and whispered cautionary tale. Official reports captured only fragments, medical observations, criminal charges that could never be served, notes from psychologists trying to undo a decade of conditioning. But the deeper story, the one that lived in the silence of those Pennsylvania woods, never disappeared. The children grew older, but the imprint of their early lives followed them into adulthood. Elias legally changed his name at 18, choosing to separate himself from the memory of the farmhouse. He earned his GED, moved across the state, and lived quietly, always choosing basement apartments, always avoiding direct sunlight, not out of fear but out of habit. His siblings followed similar paths, each trying to build a new life without the shadow of their former one. Over time, they spoke rarely about their father. And when they did, it wasn't with hatred. It was with confusion. Nathaniel believed he was protecting them from a world he imagined was decaying. He believed his purity regimen was survival, not cruelty. That belief didn't excuse his actions, but it explained them in a way that left investigators unsettled. It wasn't madness, it was conviction turned monstrous. The public's fascination faded, replaced by newer stories, newer scandals. But in Pine Hollow, the case remained a quiet wound. The old farmhouse was demolished in 1978. Though locals said the land still felt wrong, no wildlife returned for years. Hunters avoided it. Forestry workers claimed their equipment malfunctioned near the property line. A few swore they heard footsteps in the ruins long after they'd been cleared. For the officers involved, the memory was permanent. Deputy Linda Brooks never returned to rural patrols. She transferred to an administrative role, later stating, "It wasn't the children that haunted me. It was what we almost missed. How close they came to disappearing completely." Her words became part of mandatory training in the county, the lesson that isolation hides suffering more effectively than any locked door. Academics studied the case for decades. Some argued it illustrated how environments shape the human body. Others focused on the psychological components, how fear, routine, and deprivation can mold a child's worldview until the unnatural becomes normal. A few fringe theorists insisted the children represented something more, an early example of deliberate evolutionary pressure. But the siblings themselves rejected those narratives. They were not anomalies. They were survivors. In the end, the story returned to its beginning. A quiet forest, a forgotten road, a family no one checked on soon enough. The Haverly children did not want fame. They wanted to be unseen, unstudied, unremembered. But history rarely grants that mercy. Their case became a marker, a reminder of what happens when a family retreats so far from the world that no one knows they're disappearing. And yet, even with all the reports, the interviews, the research, one unanswered question still remains. Where did Nathaniel go? Search teams never found a body. No tracks, no clothing, no sign of flight. Some believe he died in the forest. Others believe he found another place to continue his work. And a few, especially those who grew up near Pine Hollow, claim they still hear footsteps in the deeper timber when the fog rolls thick. Before you go, tell me in the comments, do you think Nathaniel survived? What part of this story shocked you the most? And what state are you watching from?